I'd trade my finest horses just to hold you tonight, the prince told the peasant girl. The church bell tolls over a storm-soaked village. A cloaked rider takes shelter in a shepherd's barn, where a peasant girl dares to treat his wounded hand. He whispers words no noble should ever speak to a commoner. But by dawn, the secret is out. He is not just a traveler. He is the heir to the throne. And the girl who touched his heart now faces ruin. For a powerful duke will stop at nothing to tear them apart. Dust rises from carriage wheels. Keys rattle on a dungeon door. Whispers of theft, betrayal, and a love too dangerous for its time echo through the palace halls. He swore he would give up crown and kingdom for her. But will that promise be enough to save her life when the trial begins? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more thunder. Rolled across the darkening Bohemian countryside as Lydia hurried her sheep toward the weathered barn. Dark clouds hung low and threatening, pressing down like a heavy wool blanket. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, making soft, pattering sounds on the dried leaves that scattered the ground. "Come along now," she called softly to the stragglers, her gentle voice carrying just enough authority to keep the flock moving. The sheep bayed nervously as lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the countryside in brief. Stark relief. Just as she managed to guide them inside, the rain began to fall in earnest. Lydia pushed against the heavy wooden doors, struggling with the iron latch that had grown stiff with age. The wind tugged at her skirts, and loosened strands of hair from beneath her cap whipped about her face. Through the increasing downpour, a dark figure appeared on the path leading to the barn. Lydia's heart quickened. Strangers could mean danger for a woman alone. The figure drew closer, and she could make out a fine cloak, though it was thoroughly soaked through. "Pray, might I seek shelter from this storm?" The man's voice carried refined tones that marked him as gentry, though he claimed, "I am but a traveler whose horse lost its footing in the mud some distance back." Lydia hesitated, her hand tight on the door. Her father had always warned about the dangers of strange men, yet leaving anyone out in such weather went against her nature. "You may enter, sir," she said finally, stepping aside to let him pass, "though I advise you to keep your distance." The stranger bowed slightly as he entered, water dripping from his cloak. "You have my word as a gentleman," he assured her, maintaining a respectful space between them as the storm intensified. A sharp crack drew their attention upward. One of the ancient roof beams had split, threatening to give way under the weight of the rain. Without hesitation, the stranger shed his cloak and moved to brace it. "Sir, please be careful," Lydia called out, but too late as he worked to secure the beam. A jagged splinter of wood caught his palm, drawing blood. "'Tis nothing," he insisted, though his face betrayed his pain. Lydia knew better. "Let me tend to that," she said firmly, gathering her herbs and clean cloth from the small kit she kept for treating the sheep. The stranger watched with curiosity as she worked, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency and wrapping it with gentle hands. "You have done this before," he observed, studying her face in the dim light of the barn's single lantern. "Many times," she answered simply, securing the bandage. "Though usually for sheep, not men." Thunder crashed overhead, making the sheep stir restlessly in their pen. The stranger's eyes never left Lydia's face as she worked, taking in her quiet confidence, the sure movements of her hands, the compassion that seemed to radiate from her very being. "I'd trade my finest horses just to hold you tonight," he whispered, so softly she nearly missed it over the sound of rain on the roof. Lydia's cheeks flushed warm, and she quickly turned away, busying herself with putting away her supplies. "You jest, sir," she said, trying to keep her voice light. No gentleman would trade fine horses for the embrace of a shepherd girl. The hours crept by as the storm raged on. Lydia tended the small fire she kept in the barn's brazier for cold nights, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Despite her best efforts to stay alert, exhaustion began to overtake her. She settled onto her wooden stool by the fire, telling herself she would rest her eyes for just a moment as the rain began to ease toward dawn. The stranger watched Lydia's sleeping form, conflict evident in his expression. The firelight softened her features, making her look almost ethereal. After a long moment of internal struggle, he closed his own eyes. Though sleep was far from his thoughts, the morning sun filtered through the barn's weathered slats, casting golden stripes across the hay-strewn floor. Lydia stirred from her uncomfortable position on the wooden stool, her neck stiff from the awkward angle. The sheep bleated softly in their pen, already awake and eager for their morning feed. Her eyes fell upon the stranger's discarded cloak, draped carefully over a hay bale. In the clear morning light, she noticed what the darkness had hidden: intricate golden embroidery along the hem. And there, bold against the rich fabric, was the royal crest of Moravia. Her heart nearly stopped. The man who had shared her barn, whose hand she had tended with such familiar care, was Prince Alaric himself. He stood near the barn door, watching her with an uncertain smile as recognition dawned on her face. Lydia dropped to her knees, her cheeks burning with mortification. "Your Highness, I had no idea. Please forgive my improper behavior last night." "Please stand," Prince Alaric said, his voice gentle but firm. He crossed the barn floor and offered his hand, the one she had bandaged. "Your kindness to a stranger in need requires no forgiveness. Indeed, I am the one who must thank you." When Lydia hesitated, he reached down and carefully helped her to her feet. "The herbs you used," he gestured to his bandaged hand, "they've eased the pain considerably. They are just simple remedies." "Your Highness," Lydia murmured, keeping her eyes lowered. "Nothing worthy of royal attention. Sometimes the simplest things hold the most value," he replied. "I would very much like to meet your father and see your home, if you would permit me." "Allow me to walk you back." Lydia's protest died on her lips at his earnest expression. They walked the short distance to her cottage in the crisp morning air, the prince asking thoughtful questions about village life that she found herself answering with surprising honesty. The cottage door creaked as they entered. Inside, her father sat in his worn chair by the hearth, where a meager fire struggled to warm the small space. His eyes widened at the sight of their noble visitor. "Father," Lydia said softly, "we are honored by His Highness Prince Alaric of Moravia." Her father tried to stand, but the prince quickly motioned for him to remain seated. "Please, sir, be comfortable. Your daughter showed me great kindness during last night's storm." As Lydia prepared a simple breakfast of brown bread and herb tile they had to offer, Prince Alaric took in their humble surroundings. His eyes noted the cracked roof beams, the carefully mended furniture, the single pot bubbling with thin porridge on the hearth. "Tell me," he said, accepting the rough clay cup with genuine gratitude, "what challenges does your village face?" Lydia found herself speaking freely of their struggles: the harsh winters, the high taxes, the difficulty of keeping sheep safe from wolves. The prince listened intently, asking questions that showed real concern. As the morning wore on, Prince Alaric stood reluctantly. "I must return to the palace, but I would very much like to show you something in return for your kindness. Would you come to the royal stables? I have some horses I think might interest you." "The royal stables, your highness?" Lydia's eyes widened. "I will send a proper escort," he assured her. "Tomorrow, perhaps." Before Lydia could respond, the sound of hooves announced the arrival of the royal carriage. Through the small window, she watched as Prince Alaric climbed in, his fine clothes contrasting sharply with their humble surroundings. As the carriage disappeared down the rutted road, another set of hoofbeats approached. The village steward, a thin man with permanent frown, dismounted before their door. In his hand was a rolled parchment bearing the prince's seal. "By order of the crown," he announced. unrolling the document with obvious satisfaction. This cottage and surrounding lands are to be seized for the expansion of the royal hunting grounds. Lydia's heart sank as she stared at the official writ, her father's trembling hand finding hers in the sudden silence of their soon-to-be lost home. That evening, Lydia sat at her father's bedside, trembling hands clutching the writ that threatened everything they had. The single candle cast dancing shadows on the cottage's rough-hewn walls as she read the cruel words aloud. To be seized for royal hunting grounds, her father whispered, his voice weak from years of illness. "Oh, my dear child, what are we to do?" He reached for her hand, his fingers cold and frail against her warm palm. Lydia thought of Prince Alaric's gentle smile, the warmth in his eyes as he'd thanked her for her care. The prince himself was here, father. He was kind and spoke of justice. Perhaps kind words mean little against the Duke's decree, her father interrupted, turning his face to the wall. We are but shepherds, my dear. The nobles play their games, and we suffer for it. But Lydia couldn't forget how the prince had listened, truly listened, to her words about village life. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams filled with royal crests and stormy skies. The next morning's sun had barely cleared the horizon when hoofbeats echoed through the village square. A royal groom, resplendent in the kingdom's colors, drew his magnificent carriage to a halt before their humble door. In his gloved hands, he held a letter sealed with golden wax. "For the Lady Lydia," he announced formally. Bowing slightly as he presented it, villagers emerged from their homes, gathering in whispered clusters. Lydia could hear their voices carrying on the morning breeze. A royal summons. That shepherd girl. Above her station, that one, the nerve of her with trembling fingers, Lydia broke the seal. Inside, elegant script invited her to visit the royal stables that very morning. The groom waited patiently as she kissed her father's cheek and donned her cleanest apron. The carriage ride passed in a blur of anxiety and wonder. Through the window, Lydia watched the familiar fields give way to manicured gardens and towering palace walls. The stables themselves were grander than any house she'd ever seen, with gleaming wooden doors and immaculate stone paths. Prince Alaric waited by the entrance, his face brightening at her arrival. "Miss Lydia," he called warmly, stepping forward to help her from the carriage. "I'm delighted you've come." He led her to a magnificent stall where a powerful black stallion stood proudly. "This is Thunder," Alaric said, his voice full of affection. "My finest mount." The horse lowered his noble head, and Lydia carefully stroked his velvet nose. "He's beautiful, Your Highness. Please, when we're alone, call me Alaric." His smile faded as he noticed her distraction. "Something troubles you." Lydia withdrew the writ from her pocket, explaining how it had arrived moments after his departure. As she spoke of her father's illness and their desperate situation, she watched the prince's expression change from confusion to anger. "This bears my uncle's seal, not mine," he said firmly. "I knew nothing of this decree, and I cannot allow it." His jaw tightened. "The Duke oversteps his authority. I will speak with him directly." "Your Highness Alaric, please, don't trouble yourself," Lydia protested. Though hope bloomed in her chest, "It is no trouble to right a wrong," he replied, his hand briefly touching hers. "But I must warn you, these matters of court take time. It may be several days before I can visit again. There are obligations I cannot ignore." "I understand," Lydia said softly. Though her heart ached at the thought of waiting, the return journey felt longer, the whispers louder as she stepped down from the royal carriage. That evening, as the sun sank behind the distant mountains, Lydia knelt beside her father's bed. The familiar words of prayer fell from her lips as she begged for the prince's promise to prove true. Outside in the gathering darkness, two shadowy figures watched the cottage intently. The Duke's men noted every detail of the royal carriage's arrival and departure. The length of her absence, the way the prince had helped her down with his own hands. Their master would be most interested in this development. 2 days passed like autumn leaves on the wind. On the third morning, Lydia was startled by the sound of hoofbeats approaching her cottage. Her heart skipped when she saw Prince Alaric dismounting from a simple brown mare, dressed in plain riding clothes that would suit any country gentleman. "Good morrow, sweet Lydia," he called, his smile bright in the morning sun. Gone were his fine silk doublet and golden rings. Instead, he wore sturdy boots and a simple leather vest that would not look out of place in the village square. "Your Highness?" Lydia gasped, dropping into a curtsy. "You should not be here alone." "What will people say?" "Let them say what they will," Alaric replied, helping her rise. "And please, today I am simply Alaric. I came to learn about your life, not to stand on ceremony." Lydia's cheeks flushed as she led him to the broken fence that needed mending. "The work is hard, my lord Alaric. Your hands will blister." "Then they shall blister honestly," he said, rolling up his sleeves. Together they worked side by side, Alaric following her lead as she showed him how to replace the rotted posts and secure the rails. Word spread quickly through the village. Curious faces peered from windows and doorways as their prince labored beside the shepherd's daughter. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others watched in wonder as Alaric carried water buckets from the well. His fine boots splashed with mud when it came time to tend the sheep. Lydia could not help but laugh at Alaric's clumsy attempts with the shearing shears. "Mercy!" he exclaimed as the wool tangled. "I fear I am making a mess of your poor sheep." "Here," Lydia said, moving closer to guide his hands. Like this, smooth and steady. She tried to ignore how her skin tingled where their fingers touched, or how his breath warmed her cheek as she demonstrated the proper technique. The afternoon sun was sinking when they finally finished their tasks. Alaric's face was smudged with dirt, his hair damp with honest sweat, but his eyes shone with satisfaction. "I have learned more about my kingdom today than in 100 court sessions," he declared. Inside the cottage, Lydia's father sat in his chair by the hearth, watching with guarded eyes as the prince ducked through their low doorway. "Welcome to our humble home, Your Highness," he said stiffly. "Please, good sir." "Call me Alaric," the prince replied, bowing respectfully to the older man. "Your daughter has shown me great kindness in teaching me the true meaning of honest work." Lydia busied herself preparing their simple supper, painfully aware of their poverty as she set out wooden bowls and spoons. The bread was 2 days old and the broth thin, but Alaric ate with genuine appreciation. "This is far better than any feast at court," he declared, breaking bread with care. "There, the food is rich, but the company poor. Here, I find the opposite to be true." Her father's stern expression softened slightly as he observed the prince's courteous manners and sincere words. "You handle yourself well for a nobleman," he admitted grudgingly. "Though I wonder what brings you so far from your fine palace." "Truth and understanding," Alaric answered simply. "How can I hope to rule justly if I do not know the lives of my people?" After the meal, Alaric rose reluctantly. "I must return before I am missed," he said, "but I will come again for the midsummer festival if you will permit it." Lydia walked with him to the door, her heart fluttering like a caged bird. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting long shadows across the yard. "Until midsummer," then she whispered, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. "Until midsummer," he echoed softly. His eyes held hers for a long moment before he mounted his horse and turned toward the palace road. Lydia stood in the doorway, watching until his figure disappeared into the gathering dusk. Her chest ached with a sweet pain she dared not name. Joy bloomed in her heart at the memory of his gentle words and genuine interest in her simple life. But fear crept in like evening shadows. What scandal might come from a prince who chose to spend his days with a shepherd's daughter? Yet, as the stars began to twinkle overhead, she could not help but smile, remembering the way he had laughed as he struggled with the sheep shears. The Midsummer Festival transformed the village into a magical realm of golden lantern light and sweet music. Garlands of wildflowers draped every doorway, and the scent of fresh-baked treats wafted from the communal tables that lined the village square. Lydia moved between the wooden tables, straightening pewter plates and arranging fresh-picked flowers in simple clay vases, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Children darted between the tables, stealing bits of honey cake when they thought no one was looking. Musicians tuned their instruments near the village well, their fiddles and pipes promising hours of dancing ahead. The evening air hummed with excitement as villagers gathered in their festival best, clean aprons and freshly pressed shirts, bits of ribbon woven into hair, and precious brass buttons polished to gleaming. Lydia smoothed her own dress, her mother's old festival gown carefully mended and adorned with a sprig of lavender. She tried not to think of Alaric or wonder if he would remember his promise to attend. The past weeks had brought more whispers than ever, some hopeful, others cruel. About the prince's visits to her cottage, a sudden hush fell over the crowd. Lydia looked up to see a magnificent white stallion entering the square, its rider resplendent in royal blue and silver. Prince Alaric sat tall in the saddle, his ceremonial sword at his hip and the crown of Moravia glinting upon his brow. Several nobles followed on horseback, their fine clothes and jewels catching the lantern light. Lydia's cheeks burned as all eyes turned from the prince to her. She dropped into a deep curtsy, her heart thundering. But before she could retreat into the crowd, Alaric dismounted in one fluid motion and strode directly to her side. "My lady," he said, loud enough for all to hear, and took her trembling hand in his. The musicians struck up a lively tune, and Alaric led her to the center of the square. "Your Highness," Lydia whispered, "the nobles are watching." Indeed, the courtiers who had accompanied him wore expressions of shock and dismay. "Let them watch," Alaric replied with a gentle smile. "Tonight, we dance." He drew her into the steps of a country reel, one that every village child learned at their mother's knee. Lydia's fear melted as muscle memory took over. Alaric matched her movements perfectly, having practiced during his visits to her cottage. They spun and stepped, hands meeting and parting in the ancient patterns of the dance. The crowd's silence broke into scattered applause, then swelled to cheers. Other couples joined the dance, merchants' daughters with farm boys, traders with innkeepers' wives, even a few brave nobles with villagers. The lantern lights sparkled off silk and homespun alike as the square filled with twirling dancers. "Look," Alaric whispered as he turned Lydia under his arm. "This is how it should be. All my people celebrating together, no walls between them." Lydia's heart soared at his words. From the edge of the crowd, she heard an old woman say, "That prince, he sees us common folk. Perhaps he'll be the one to change things." Others nodded, hope kindling in their eyes. The music quickened, and Alaric drew Lydia closer. In his arms, she forgot about class and custom, about the cottage she might lose, about everything except the joy of this moment. His eyes never left her face, and she saw in them a future she had never dared to imagine. But at the edge of the square, partially hidden in the shadow of the chapel, Duke Leopold watched the revelry with growing rage. His pale fingers gripped his wine goblet so tightly his knuckles showed white, and his thin lips curved in a cruel smile. "This has gone far enough," he hissed to his steward, who hovered at his elbow like a dark ghost. "The girl makes a mockery of our class. She must be dealt with." The steward bent closer to catch his master's words as the Duke continued, his voice barely audible above the music. "Before the new moon rises, I want her name dragged through the mud. See to it that no noble family would ever consider accepting her, not even as a scullery maid. The steward nodded, his eyes cold as he watched Lydia laughing in the prince's arms. Unaware of the shadow about to fall across her happiness, the morning sun cast long shadows through the church's stained glass windows, painting the worn wooden pews in splashes of red and gold. Lydia clutched her worn prayer book tightly as whispers followed her down the aisle. The fine ladies in their silk dresses and lace bonnets turned away, their fans fluttering like angry birds as they muttered behind them. "The audacity," one noblewoman hissed, loud enough for Lydia to hear. "Dancing with the prince himself." Lydia's cheeks burned as she made her way to the back pews where the servants and peasants usually sat. Her father's gentle hand on her arm steadied her, though she could see the worry etched in his weathered face. The familiar comfort of the church, usually a sanctuary, now felt cold and unwelcoming as the priest delivered his sermon about humility and knowing one's proper place. Pointed glances were cast in Lydia's direction. She kept her eyes fixed on her prayer book, the words blurring through unshed tears. The service ended with a hymn, its usually uplifting notes now feeling hollow. As the congregation filed out into the bright morning sun, a sudden hush fell over the crowd. Prince Alaric stood waiting by the church gate, dressed simply but elegantly in riding clothes. "Good morrow, Lydia," he called out warmly, striding forward to meet her. The crowd parted like water, nobles drawing back as if his attention to a commoner might somehow taint them. "Your Highness," Lydia curtsied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here," but Alaric merely smiled, offering his arm. "I would be honored to walk with you, if you'll permit me." They strolled through the village, past the market stalls and baker's shop. Common folk stopped to bow, some smiling cautiously at this extraordinary sight. Children peeked around corners, pointing and whispering in wonder at their prince walking arm in arm with the shepherd's daughter. Yet the nobles who passed them in, their fine carriages wore expressions of barely concealed disgust. One elderly countess nearly fainted at the sight, her maid having to fan her vigorously. "You mustn't worry about them," Alaric said softly, noticing Lydia's discomfort. "Their world is changing, whether they wish it or not." When Alaric finally bid her farewell, promising to send word soon, Lydia returned home with a mixture of joy and dread in her heart. That feeling turned to ice when she saw the letter waiting on her doorstep, sealed with the Duke's crest. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and read the elegant script. "Your continued association with His Highness has become intolerable. Should you persist in this impropriety, know that your father's fate rests in my hands. Not only will your lands be forfeit, but I shall see him imprisoned for crimes I need not fabricate. Consider carefully your next actions, girl." Lydia sank onto a chair, the letter falling from her numb fingers. In the palace, unknown to her, Alaric faced his own crisis. The royal council had summoned him to an urgent meeting, where maps and treaties lay spread across polished tables. "Your Highness," the chief counselor began, "the trade routes through the eastern provinces grow more precarious by the day. Princess Elena of Austria would make a most advantageous match. The marriage contract has already been drafted." Alaric stood at the window, his jaw tight. "And if I refuse? Then our people face a winter without grain," another counselor replied gravely. "The Austrian routes are vital, Your Highness. Surely a prince understands that duty must come before personal inclinations." As darkness fell that evening, Lydia sat alone in her cottage, a single candle casting flickering shadows on the wall. Her father slept fitfully in the next room, his cough worse than usual. The Duke's letter lay heavy in her apron pocket, its threats echoing in her mind. The peaceful night shattered as rocks suddenly crashed through her window, sending glass shards skittering across the floor. Cruel laughter and shouts of temptress, and which came from outside. Lydia huddled in the corner, covering her ears as more stones flew through the broken window. each one carrying the weight of the Duke's malice. The autumn morning dawned cold and gray as Lydia received the royal summons. Her hands trembled as she read the carefully penned words requesting her presence at court to discuss the hunting grounds decree. A borrowed shawl of faded blue wool wrapped around her shoulders, the finest thing she could manage for such an occasion. The great hall of the palace stretched before her like something from a dream. Towering marble columns reached toward gilded ceilings where crystal chandeliers sparkled in the morning light. Nobles in silks and velvets lined the walls, their whispers following her every step across the polished floor. The hem of her simple dress brushed against the intricate patterns of the carpet as she approached the raised dais where King Matthias sat upon his throne. To his right stood Duke Leopold, his sharp eyes gleaming with barely concealed satisfaction. To his left, Prince Alaric watched her approach, his face tight with concern. "Step forward, girl," the Duke commanded, his voice carrying through the hushed hall. "His Majesty wishes to hear your grievances regarding the hunting decree." Before Lydia could speak, Alaric moved to stand beside her. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled courtiers. Father Alaric addressed the king directly, his voice strong and clear. "Before you hear her testimony, I must speak. This woman before you possesses more nobility of spirit than many who wear fine silks and golden chains. She tends her sick father with unwavering devotion, shows kindness to strangers without thought of reward, and faces injustice with quiet dignity." The Duke's face darkened. "Your Majesty, surely we need not waste time on such." "I am not finished, uncle," Alaric cut in, his tone sharp as steel. "I have seen firsthand the struggles of our people through Lydia's eyes. She has taught me more about true leadership than all your carefully crafted lessons." For one shining moment, hope bloomed in Lydia's chest as she saw something soften in the king's weathered face. Even some of the nobles appeared, moved by Alaric's passionate defense. But fate, and the Duke had other plans. That very evening, as shadows lengthened across the countryside, Alaric was suddenly called away. Urgent business at the border estates, the messengers claimed, bearing documents with the royal seal. He had time only to press Lydia's hand briefly before mounting his horse and galloping into the gathering dusk. The cottage felt especially quiet that night as Lydia prepared her father's evening meal. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and she had just settled him into his chair when the door burst open with a thunderous crack. The Duke's guards poured in, their boots muddy on the clean floor, their hands already reaching for her. Among them strode the Duke's steward, holding her borrowed shawl with exaggerated care. This was found among His Highness's private belongings, the steward announced, his thin lips curved in a cruel smile. A common thief stealing from the royal family itself. "No," Lydia cried as rough hands seized her arms. "That's not possible." Silence, thief." The guard captain shook her roughly. "You'll face the king's justice for this." Her father struggled to rise from his chair, his face ashen. "Please, she's innocent." She would never, but his protests fell on deaf ears as they dragged Lydia into the night. Cold iron shackles bit into her wrists as they forced her into a prison wagon. Through her tears, she watched her cottage and her father disappear into the darkness. The descent into the castle dungeons felt like being lowered into a grave. The guards threw her into a dank cell with moldering straw scattered across the stone floor. The heavy door clanged shut with horrible finality. Leaving her alone in the suffocating darkness, Lydia huddled against the cold wall, drawing her knees to her chest as tears slid silently down her cheeks. Something skittered across the floor, rats seeking crumbs in the filthy straw. In her mind, she heard again the Duke's satisfied laughter as they dragged her past his chambers, the sound of it echoing in her thoughts like poison. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer into the darkness, trying to hold on to hope as the rats ventured. Closer to her skirts and water dripped endlessly, somewhere in the blackness beyond her. The stone walls of the dungeon wept with cold moisture as Lydia huddled in her narrow cell. 7 days had passed since the guards had dragged her from her cottage. Each morning brought only a crust of stale bread and a cup of cloudy water, barely enough to keep her alive. Her once sturdy frame grew thin, and her spirits dimmed like the guttering torch in the corridor above in the village square. Tongues wagged with tales of the shepherd girl who dared reach above her station. A common thief, some whispered. She bewitched the prince, others claimed. Yet there were those who remembered her gentle ways, her care for her father, her honest work with the sheep. These few dared to suggest, in hushed tones, that perhaps she was innocent. On the 4th night, a small figure crept through the shadows. "Miss Lydia?" came a whisper, barely louder than a mouse. It was Tomas, the stable boy, his face dirty but his eyes bright with purpose. "Tomas." Lydia crawled to the bars, her chains rattling softly. "You shouldn't be here. They'll punish you." "I saw them, miss," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "The Duke's men. They went into the prince's chambers with your shawl. I was cleaning the stables late, and I saw everything through the window." Lydia's heart leaped. "You saw them plant it?" Tomas nodded vigorously. "They laughed about it too. Said you'd learn your place in the dungeon." His young face hardened with determination. "I'll tell everyone at the trial. I swear it." "No, Tomas." Lydia reached through the bars to grasp his small hand. "The Duke would hurt you." "I couldn't bear that. I'm not afraid," he declared, though his voice quavered. "The prince always says we must stand up for what's right, even if we're scared." Before Lydia could argue further, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Tomas vanished like a shadow at sunrise, leaving Lydia alone with a flame of hope in her heart. The next morning brought a commotion above. Horses' hooves clattered in the courtyard, voices raised in argument. Prince Alaric had returned from his journey to find his beloved imprisoned. "This is madness." His voice thundered through the stone corridors. "Release her at once." "My dear nephew," the Duke's oily tones replied, "surely you understand. The honor of the crown is at stake. We cannot simply dismiss charges of theft against a royal person, regardless of your personal feelings." "Personal feelings." Alaric's voice cracked with fury. "You engineered this, uncle. What proof have you?" "The shawl was found among your private belongings," the Duke said smoothly. "Witnessed by 3 respected members of the court. The trial will proceed as law demands." Heavy boots descended the dungeon stairs. Lydia looked up to see Alaric's face, twisted with anguish, appear at her cell. His hands gripped the iron bars until his knuckles went white. "My love," he whispered, reaching through to touch her cheek. "What have they done to you?" "I'm alive," Lydia managed a weak smile. "That's enough for now. Listen to me." Alaric's voice was fierce with determination. "I will see justice done. I swear it on my life and crown. They will not destroy you with these lies." Lydia pressed her face against his hand, drawing strength from his touch. "The crown is your birthright. Don't risk it for me." "Without justice, a crown is nothing but metal and stones," Alaric replied. "I would rather lose it 1,000 times than see you suffer for loving me." A guard's voice called from above. "Your Highness, the council awaits." Alaric's grip tightened on the bars. "Hold fast, my love. Truth will triumph, no matter the cost." Their eyes met in the dim light, love and determination bridging the space between them. Then Alaric was gone, his footsteps fading up the stairs, leaving Lydia alone with the ember of hope his visit had kindled in her. The great hall loomed, vast and cold on the morning of the trial. Hundreds of candles flickered in iron chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across the carved wooden panels. Nobles in silk and velvet lined the walls, their faces painted with disdain. In the gallery above, peasants pressed shoulder to shoulder. Their rough clothes and work-worn hands, a stark contrast to the finery below. Lydia stood before the throne, chains binding her wrists. Though her dress was plain and her face pale from days in the dungeon, she held her head high. The iron links clinked softly as she shifted her weight, the sound echoing in the hushed chamber. Duke Leopold stepped forward, his voice carrying to every corner. "Your Majesty's court has gathered to witness justice. This common shepherd girl stands accused of theft and," he paused, lip curling, "of seducing a prince with common witchery." One by one, the Duke's witnesses came forward. A chambermaid claimed to have seen Lydia stealing into the prince's quarters. A guard testified to finding her shawl among Alaric's belongings. Each accusation fell like a stone, building a wall of judgment around her. But then, a small figure darted forward from the crowd. Young Tomas, the stable boy, trembled as he faced the assembly. His voice quavered, but grew stronger with each word. "My lords and ladies, I speak the truth before God. I saw the Duke's men plant that shawl in the prince's chambers. They did it in the dark of night, thinking none would see." Gasps rippled through the hall. The Duke's face darkened like a thundercloud. "This boy lies," he snarled. "He is nothing but a stable hand. His word worth less than horse dung. Yet he shows more courage than many nobles I know," came a clear voice. Prince Alaric strode into the center of the hall, his boots ringing on the stone floor. He turned slowly, meeting the eyes of every lord and lady present. "I stand before you all to declare what I have learned from this shepherd girl." His gaze softened as it fell upon Lydia. "I would trade my finest horses, even my crown, for her hand in mine, for she has taught me what true nobility is. Not the silk we wear, nor the titles we bear, but the courage to stand for truth and the compassion to aid those in need." The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted in outrage, peasants cheered, and the Duke's face twisted in fury. But all fell silent as trumpets blazed and the great doors swung wide. King Matthias entered, his presence commanding immediate silence. His gray eyes swept the assembly as he took his place upon the throne. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "We have watched and listened these many weeks," the king declared. "While some played at politics, we saw a simple shepherd girl care for her sick father, tend her flock with dignity, and face injustice with unwavering courage." He rose, and all heads bowed. "The hunting decree is hereby annulled. The lands shall remain with those who have tended them faithfully." His stern gaze fell upon the Duke. "Furthermore, we strip Duke Leopold of his authority, for he has wielded power with cruelty rather than wisdom." The Duke staggered back, his face ashen. The king turned to Alaric and Lydia, his expression softening. "As for love that crosses the boundaries we mortals draw, perhaps it is God's way of teaching us that such boundaries mean little in his sight." He gestured to the guards. "Remove those chains." The iron links fell away from Lydia's wrists, clattering on the stone floor. For a moment, she stood still, hardly daring to believe. Then Alaric stepped forward, gathering her into his arms before the entire assembly. Tears of joy sparkled in her eyes as she lifted her face to his. A sound like summer thunder rolled through the great hall. Applause, beginning in the peasants' gallery and spreading until it filled every corner. Lords and ladies who had sneered now found themselves cheering despite their prejudices. In that moment, all could see that true nobility shone in the eyes of the shepherd girl and her prince, brighter than any crown. 3 Sundays after the trial, the village church glowed with hundreds of beeswax candles. Morning light streamed through stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the worn stone floor. The small church had never seen such a gathering. Nobles in their silk finery seated beside villagers in their Sunday best, all waiting with bated breath King Matthias himself sat in the front pew, his presence lending gravity and blessing to the occasion. Though some nobles still wore pinched expressions, none dared show open disdain under their sovereign's watchful eye. The wooden doors creaked open, and Lydia appeared in the doorway. Her gown was simple white wool, adorned only with tiny flowers from the meadow where she once tended sheep. Yet she glowed with an inner radiance that outshone the finest silk. Her father stood tall beside her, his health restored by the royal physician's care, his eyes bright with tears of joy as they walked slowly down the aisle. The village children scattered rose petals in their path. Prince Alaric waited at the altar, his face transformed with wonder as he watched his bride approach. He wore his formal court attire, yet his expression held none of the pride of station, only pure love and gratitude. Lydia's father placed her hand in Alaric's with dignified pride, his weathered farmer's fingers touching the prince's sword-calloused ones in a gesture that bridged worlds. The priest's voice echoed under the vaulted ceiling as he spoke the ancient words of blessing. When the couple exchanged their vows, their voices rang clear and true. Alaric's "I do" carried the weight of a prince's word of honor. Lydia's response held the simple honesty that had first won his heart. As they kissed, the candlelight seemed to brighten, and even the most hardened nobles found themselves wiping away tears. The celebration spilled into the village square, where long tables groaned under platters of roasted meat, fresh bread, and sweet pastries. The king had ordered the royal kitchens to provide a feast for all, and villagers who had never tasted such delicacies sat beside lords and ladies who had never known the pleasure of simple bread broken in true fellowship. Musicians played both courtly minuets and village reels. After some initial hesitation, noble ladies found themselves learning country dances from farmers' wives, while lordly gentlemen discovered the joy of simple circle dances. Laughter rang out as old barriers crumbled in the face of shared celebration. Lydia moved through the crowd, her joy infectious. She danced with her father, with the king himself, and with young Tomas, whose courage had helped save her. The stable boy now wore new clothes, having been appointed as royal master of horse, a position earned by his honesty as twilight painted the sky in soft purples and golds. Alaric took Lydia's hand and led her to where his finest stallion waited. The magnificent horse stood proud, its coat gleaming like polished copper in the fading light. Alaric helped Lydia mount, then swung up behind her before they rode off. He leaned close to her ear, his voice soft with tender memory. "I'd trade my finest horses just to hold you tonight," he whispered. Echoing those words from their first meeting in the storm, Lydia turned to meet his gaze, her eyes shining with love and certainty. Their lips met in a gentle kiss as the first stars appeared above. Then, with her hands securely in his, they rode together toward the castle, leaving behind a gathering where love had truly bridged the divide of class and transformed a kingdom. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.